The talk today aims to connect the dots on what is closing in on about a decade-long journey. One that, I'm not going to say it's ending, but I do hope, for me, is beginning to shift course. So I have understood the destination of this journey, but it probably hasn't been clear to even the most diligent of my readers out there. So in today's talk, I want to explain what I think I've been up to and why, and revisit a body of work now in aggregate, somewhat to highlight how much our thinking has changed in what's really been a short period of time. And I'm structuring this as a journey, partly because I didn't want to just sort of focus on work that's already been published, and I don't know that I have anything new to say, because there was a whole flurry of work, and yeah, I think people are still reading it. But also tied to sort of the mentoring practice that I use is a process of demystification and talking about the story behind the work and sharing work in progress. And I think it might be helpful for many people to hear some of my reflections on the challenges of doing work on a thing that won't stand still. And to that end, I'd say my key pieces of advice are, first of all, know your question. And I think over the course of the next 30 minutes, I will reveal what my question actually has been in this inquiry, even though I don't think it's actually well represented by any single publication. And also, know why it is your question. And I think that's the advice that I'd offer, because it can be very challenging when there's new news every day, often about these things that we're studying, and you just sort of have to block it out. Because just because we know something is announced or something might happen, it doesn't always happen. I work with a team who studies video games and wrote a book about, what is it, the platform that just tried to change its business model. Oh, come on. David's not here yet, he'll know. Oh, what is it? I'm losing its name. Anyway, sure enough, within like 2 days, this announcement that was going to entirely render all of their studies, pointless, the company changed track and took it back, right? So this kind of stuff happens to us when we're studying things that are changing day by day. And so trying to create your own distance can be helpful. So the journey. I've chosen to begin the journey in 2014, which is actually fairly accurate, because the confession is that I am not an early adopter, and I am not a cinephile. And so I did not have Netflix until the end of 2013. I never had a DVD by mail service, which I think is an important thing to remember, especially to outside the US, that is the origin of this company, that probably wouldn't have been able to exist otherwise, but we increasingly forget that history. So why did I not have Netflix? I was being pretty well served. I wasn't happy about it because it was a very expensive cable service that we had in the United States. But between what my channels offered me and what a DVR and then VOD that came from my cable provider offered, I was pretty well satisfied. I was watching everything I could watch. I had seen most of what was on Netflix because I was a TV scholar and was, watching a lot. Certainly I had been watching Netflix, like the company and the discourse around it, very much with a raised eyebrow. And again, it's to take you back in time. I think it's important to remember that in 2014, very few people thought this thing was going to exist. Like, the skeptics were strong. Like, the notion that somehow people would pay for this thing. I mean, part of this is only a US service at the time. People are paying ridiculous amounts of money, as I know you do in Canada as well, for their cable service. Like, why would people pay anything more? And it wasn't clear that it was going to substitute. So remember that, or it's from the vantage point of today, in which it seems like this an amazing company that's very strong and powerful. Not many people thought that would be the case. So my own journey, I was revising The Television Will Be Revolutionized in 2013, and that was the thing that sort of made it clear that, oh, I'm gonna have to pay attention to this. Is this gonna be a thing? But the real reason that I was interested was because we were at that point that Netflix started announcing original content. And in the environment in that moment, we're coming off of the heady first decade of HBO, which I was waiting to gauge the room and roughly the age of that room, how much I needed to explain this. So in the first decade of the 21st century, HBO's brand campaign was, it's not TV, it's HBO. And that was a thing that obsessed a lot of media scholars. And generally, many of us were also very excited about the stories that HBO was telling because they were much more sophisticated than what had happened on US television before. And I think that's fair to say. I understood as an industry scholar that, well, yes, it's not TV, it's HBO, but that had nothing to do with the programming. It had everything to do with the business model. And the fact that HBO was relying on subscriber funding was what enabled them to be doing different things in programming. And I recognized that Netflix, too, was using that business model. And so perhaps this was going to be a space in which different kinds of content would be developed than had been characteristic of the mode of production typical in the US. And that's really where my interest came from. Because again, as background, I am of an age that for most of my life, television was a bad object. My very much part of that is coming from the United States, where it was an overwhelmingly commercial mode of production that was focused on things like efficiency, making programming that was generally going to satisfy the most viewers. That was what the US production system was set up to do. And I understood that wasn't television. That was the US mode of production. And so if the only way that US television was going to change was for its mode of production to either change or expand, and that's what I saw HBO doing, and initially that's really what has made me curious about streaming, because I saw in various ways that the rules, the forces on the industry were going to be different. And so my journey has actually been out of a curiosity about what will this do for the stories. But if you've been reading the work, the stories aren't really there. But it's taken a while to get there and to figure out what the possibilities are. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in 2014, wow, we have come a long way in a decade now almost, in terms of the structuring thinking. And at that point, I would describe it as still very much a moment of tech determinism. What I mean by that was that the frame in which Netflix was understood was it was a tech company. We've gotten a little better about recognizing that the tech is not actually an industry, but we have now companies in many different industries that are doing things differently due to the affordances of the internet as a technology. But in 2014, that was not on the cards. And in that moment, it seems ridiculous to say this, but from really up even through 2017, the frame was really, these things are internet, they're tech, they're different as new media. Netflix and YouTube are very much the same because of that, and they're different from broadcasting. And so that was the pervasive logic at the time. I don't have to explain anymore how Netflix and YouTube are different, fortunately, but that was a thing that needed to happen as I began to write about this work. So from roughly 2014 to 17, I was writing Portals and We Now Disrupt sort of together, which wasn't exactly the plan. I was mostly trying to write We Now Disrupt This Broadcast, which is a 20-year journey of how first the changes in US cable lead to different kinds of programming in US cable, and then sort of at that point more speculatively, because it was early, how internet distribution was going to also potentially lead to some different kinds of programming as well. And I'd done the work in other projects I hadn't figured out what the story was, but I had done enough of the research on the cable bit. But in order to get across the internet that I needed to spend some time writing in an academic voice. We Now Disrupt was sort of meant to hopefully reach a broader audience than just academics, but the footnotes are there for the academics. And so Portals is a deeply nerdy dive into subscriber funding, because that work just hadn't been done. Despite as much work as had been written about HBO and its shows, very little had actually tried to understand the business model of getting people to pay for access to an array of programming. And at that point, 2014, HBO is still very linear. And it's hard to talk about HBO in an international setting because sort of the experience of those shows are so different for everyone depending on where you reach those shows. But for me, the origin of what made those HBO shows possible was a very specific business model, regardless of where they sold later. And that was subscriber funding. So Portals, what does Portals accomplish? In my mind, first, per its title, it claims internet distributed television, which was an appropriate thing to do in 2017. I will still stand behind that. And that was, this is an aha moment that comes via, it's Lisa Gittleman's work via Henry Jenkins, explaining that there's a difference between media, words, pictures, audiovisual images, or audiovisual, all of that media, and distribution technologies. And as Jenkins just brilliantly, in like a matter of one sentence, sort of says, media persist, distribution technologies change. And it's like, aha! And again, like the context of where everyone is trying, everyone, I don't even know who I mean by everyone there, trade press, the dominant journalistic frame, the buzz about is that these things are, they're webisodes, this is web TV, this is new media, and that just didn't fit, actually. If you looked at what Netflix was circa 2017, it was internet distributed television and movies, but mostly it seemed television. So calling it something else didn't make a lot of sense. And so that's the first part. The other part that's helpful was a definition that Lynn Spiegel provides us. You can't see it, it's really small if you don't know the collection. The most brilliantly titled book ever, Television After TV, Essays on a Medium in Transition. And certainly in 2004, it was a medium in transition. And in the early 2000s, folks like me, we were having a lot of conferences, much like this, and doing things like talking about what is television, on and on. And Spiegel kind of comes in and intervenes and says, television's not just technology, right? Because a lot was changing all at once. Television standards, the screens we were watching on, and it was really hard to process what was the change that mattered in the moment that it was happening. And now it's sort of obvious. But it didn't seem obvious at that time. And then Spiegel's like, it's not just the technology, though. What makes television television is also its industrial practices, what I've shortened here to a mode of production, the practices of viewing, and the regulatory structures in which it interacts. And in 2017, the technology was expanding for sure. We were watching on different screens somewhat. Most of us weren't, so it was not a widespread phenomenon. Practices of viewing for some had changed some of the time. Mode of production, you only had Netflix doing a little bit of its own originals. Mode of production really hadn't changed. So again, in 2017, it felt, yes, this is internet distributed television. The thing we don't need to re-theorize this as some sort of entirely other form of media. All right, so does that, I don't think I want to jump ahead here. I haven't been following my notes, which is never a good idea. Yes, so I've noted that so much made sense after having the framework of recognizing the difference between media and distribution technologies has just been utterly crucial to making sense not only of Netflix, but of so much that then came after. And so, and this in the moment was really a pushback on others that were developed, trying to talk about web TV as though it was a distinctive thing, when it wasn't clear what are those modes of practice. Those practices of viewing were quite limited. And when I'm saying we here at this point, a lot of this is very North American and probably US specific. I certainly know that the histories of this development are different in different places, but I was not at a point where I was across anything more than the US at that point. So the other thing that Portals does, I would say, is to introduce this language of protocols, which again comes from Gittleman, and acknowledge that yes, there are some differences. Netflix doesn't have schedule, it doesn't have flow in the way that we've understood it, or ads, which were all things that from an American perspective we thought define television. Or does it just define a mode of production or a particular business model? Within Portals, I went looking for an economic model. There's nothing really in media scholarship that would help me understand subscriber funding. What I also ultimately found was the club model, which was developed by an array of Francophone scholars, both in France and in Montreal. And I relied heavily on translation, so there's probably a lot more to be explored there. But the club model was the economic concept behind something like a health club, which really is the closest antecedent. This idea that you pay for access to a thing, and then we all share the thing, and that's how the economics of it works. And that's really different from how advertising had worked. But they're just, even within, there's not that, the club model literature is not all that extensive. And so the other thing that I'm doing in Portals is working with Bernard Miège's models, which I've been using in broader industry work for some time to organize the differences of media industry operation, and exploring how subscriber funding sort of fits within the publishing model and sort of fits within the flow model, but it was distinct from the models that he had set up at that time. So sort of based on understanding those structural differences, I think it's fair to use the verb speculate. The book speculates on what non-linear subscriber-funded services might do differently from linear ad-supported ones. It contemplates vertical integration a bit. I'd say ultimately I was less imagining Disney Plus and Paramount Plus, for example, as they've come to be, but more sensing how inefficient economically US cable was, and what would happen when that system was ultimately upset. And I think that's a moment that we've actually just reached in the last 12 to 18 months, and is not to be underestimated in terms of what will be the ongoing effect. I was just reading, one of the US analysts was basically estimating that the situation of US cable, in which you had almost 100 million people paying $100 a month for services, which has significantly waned, that norm was injecting $10 to $15 billion a year into what we think of maybe as the studios. And so if we want to look at the content that has been produced, what often gets labeled peak TV, that was underwritten by American cable consumers, and they're not paying anymore. So to the degree that we're seeing probably some pretty big changes in coming years, that's not necessarily streamers that are doing that, as sort of often gets pointed to. It's the fundamental economics of how content has been produced are and will continue to change. But that's something we only know 10 years down the road, so I suppose I should go back in time. Other things that I want to acknowledge, I don't call things portals. So my students often try to use the language, and I just stop. Again, in that moment, I needed language to distinguish what Netflix was and what it was doing, and to be able to say, I'm not talking about YouTube. YouTube's super interesting. There's some other folks doing some great work on that, but as a business, that thing is entirely different. And so portals was a way to sort of subdivide that space. So I don't run around talking about portals. All right. At the end of 2018, I moved to Australia. And so 2019 was a recovery year in a variety of ways. And I was spending a lot of time in which everything was strange, which was really exciting intellectually. Challenging, but exciting. It's the beginning of the work, more focused work with Ramon. We shared a grant for about 3 years, which a variety of work came out of. But the first was the article in Media Industries, which actually took forever to get out. And that was very much saying, hey, all right, we've got these portals, but also they're not all the same. And recognizing the need to, because by that moment we had, Disney Plus had launched, Apple TV was launching, and there was this tendency, this is the streaming wars rhetoric begins to emerge. That is really simple, and constructing these services as all the same and not recognizing their significant differences. So in that we really began to try to create criteria or categories by which we might organize the differences in order to say intelligent things about what these services were actually doing. I was also writing Media Disrupted, although I'd say most of my attention was on the industries I hadn't written a lot about, which were newspapers and music, although the work on newspapers and coming to understand what had happened in 2 print publications in the first decade of the 21st century is proving increasingly valuable to understanding what is now happening to television, because sadly, it doesn't seem we learn our lessons, we just keep repeating them. Moving into 2020 then, this was my question. Because at this point, Netflix is clearly trying to do something multinational. It doesn't make sense to just look at it from the US. And I know that I can't talk about Netflix as one thing, and it doesn't seem like I should, it's in 190 countries, but it's both impossible and it doesn't really make sense to talk about it as 190 different things. So what is a defensible way to organize this thing? And that is my question. And so the first place that I try to explore this is in this IJCS article, which is attempting to attempting to answer it based on whatever data was available. At that point, I was also reading a lot of Gene Chalabi's work on the internationalization of the cable and satellite industries. Part of that was sort of putting streaming in context and recognizing this internationalization that streaming was going to push had actually a longer trajectory. But it was also in reading Chalabi's work that I figured out a key difference between what streaming services could do versus what cable and satellite had done. And what cable and satellite had done is, yes, there's a Disney Channel in every country, we can think about that as internationalization, but cable and satellite was still nationally organized. So it was a federated internationalization. Whereas what at least Netflix was doing was going direct to consumer in multiple countries. And there's a way in which that boundaries from a business perspective can be erased when that's your model. Because now you're able to aggregate audiences across a globe instead of trying to build a mass of audiences in each country. And that was due to the fact that cable and satellite were still overwhelmingly advertiser funded, and advertising at that point is still overwhelmingly sold at a national level. So you're trying to create content that will build audiences organized within nations. And that is different than trying to service viewers without those boundaries. So it's just, at that point, largely a speculative recognition of something different happening here. So this is the beginning of using all kinds of ways or all kinds of bits of data to try and sort, the 190 in some ways. So, these are the countries with most subscribers, countries with highest penetration. This is where we were in terms of countries and the number of commissions or co-commissions they have. What sense can we make of any of this? Well, a bit. in finishing that work, I didn't have evidence that fully made me satisfied in all cases, but my sense, like, if I was going to say, like, this is my gut instinct on what we've got going on here. One, that beyond the global, in terms of what Netflix was doing versus the federated system, different. Also, that not all video distribution was the same. And that's me speaking a bit to a moment in which, maybe it was a bit Australian in context, but the conversation was really that it wasn't recognizing complementarity. Like, Netflix wasn't coming in and reproducing what national, commercial, or PSBs were doing. It was complementing in many cases, and that immediately jumping to a competition framework led us to miss some of the differences. At that point is also pushing back against the streaming wars discourse. They're really varied. They're going to continue to change. We can't just put them all in one box. And the data that I had at that point, although not great, it was making it pretty clear that Netflix was different. And Netflix was not going to be global in the way Hollywood had typically been global. And so we were doing a fair bit of conceptual damage when we just sort of lumped together all US-based streaming services as though they were the same thing. All right, we get to the pandemic. And in the pandemic year, I was lucky enough to have children that could still go to school, and yet I couldn't do much other than think and write. And so I began to put together the blog that then largely supports Netflix and streaming video. And we're in a moment where so much was launching. The press discourse is just this heady speculation and claims that just struck me as wrong. And so my organization was very much to sort of take things that were said in the trade press that were wrong, turn them into questions, and explain why they were wrong. And that helped me get through a process of writing. Marriott Polity had been asking for a book about streaming for years, and I couldn't write, like, I can't figure out what that is. And so doing the blog posts and then stepping away from it when I realized I had 50,000 words, and coming back to it, I was like, oh, there's a book here. This works. And it's, a book in the moment because the stuff keeps changing. So some comments on that. Netflix and streaming video publishes in April of 2022, approximately 2 weeks before the Netflix announcement, in which it says, we're gonna have ads. This book about subscriber-funded video on demand, which fortunately is a light gray subtitle, so maybe no one noticed. Okay, but in terms of practice and process, I give you this. I waited a long time to write about Netflix, and honestly, the book is not about Netflix. You put Netflix in the title because then people buy it and it gets read. So the book is not actually, I would say, about Netflix. It is about subscriber-funded streaming video. It is about a moment in time. How long that moment in time is going to extend to, I cannot yet say. But I will say we are now in November of 23, so almost a year, more than a year and a half past that moment. And I still couldn't write anything. I still can't write anything about Netflix and its ad-supported model. Very few people have adopted it. That's going to change. It's not clear how that is affecting their programming strategy. It's not clear how it's affecting the things that get watched. And so the point here, this is one of those, like, things will be announced, but we will not understand how they matter for often years ahead. So just because you write a book and then the world changes doesn't mean the book is pointless, I continue to believe. But a lot of writing this, my own mental process, oh, sorry, that's also in there, that's new, that wasn't in the blogs, the structure and characteristics, that's been a helpful bit of things. But when I write, I'm often trying to imagine and hoping for someone to read my work 10 years from now. And so if you write with that frame of mind, then it shifts your tense a little bit. You recognize I am not a journalist. My job is not to make sense of the things that are happening today, the value of my work, it sounds like my affirmations, the value of my work is not that I can explain things that are happening today, because I write books, yes, I know, and they're not going to be read for 9 months until after I finish them, and so much is going to change just in that period of time, right? And so my advice is to both, sorry, I'll talk about that in a minute, write with humility and timestamps. So humility is, it's going to change, you are not writing the definitive account of anything, but timestamps, like in 2023, this is how we were talking about things. You know, like imagine that what you're doing is you are explaining this moment to someone in the future. And that's the way in which I think this kind of work can have a fair bit of longevity. So the big red circle there is noting that we're not talking about internet distributed television anymore. Quite deliberately, I think we're talking about something that streaming video is a better way to describe it. To go back to Spiegel's characteristics, by 2020, 2021, technology has changed, the mode of production has changed widely. Now, Hollywood studios are also using this kind of production practices that were at first just distinctive to Netflix. A lot of people are watching a considerable amount in a way quite different than a linear environment. So it is at this point, and what we have here is not just television that is being, it is not just internet distributed television. Oh no, a little farther behind than I thought. Okay, so last slides quickly. In 2022 then, because we couldn't go anywhere because we were in Australia and we weren't allowed to come in or out, we got a data set from Ampere Analysis that helped answer some other questions. And so out of that data set, and I know Oliver Eklund, who was my co-author on both of these articles, we set out to figure out what looking at libraries could tell us. So the JOC article, in many ways, is giving a different set of data to the same questions from that earlier IJCS article, because it allowed us to take a look at what was in the Netflix libraries. And it allowed us to understand that 60% of all libraries are the same, or 60% of the titles in all the libraries are the same. The size of all the libraries, at least by 2021, also about all the same. So that had changed from early on. That of that 60% that's the same, roughly half of that, so 30% of all titles, are Netflix originals that are generally available everywhere. Okay, that's interesting. And so then the question became, well, what about the things that aren't the same everywhere? Okay. And we were able to see these kind of clusters, that there are sort of these regional, we can see regional clusters that are fairly similar, but also a fair bit of variation. The other key top-level finding there was that only 40% of any catalog, including the US catalog, was US produced, which, since we also had the data from the Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, those, we could see, indeed, Netflix is doing something quite different. 90% of those libraries are US produced. So that was helpful to sort of have data that helped. I mean, that doesn't say what anybody is watching, which of course we don't have yet, but to the degree that what these services are is their libraries, we knew new things. We then pivoted, and this article is just recently out, beyond Netflix. See, you can still put Netflix in the title when you're not talking about Netflix. And looked at a selection of services. These are not rigorously, we can't generalize any of this, but we wanted to have sort of a collection of services that were well established. And we did sort of the same kind of comparison to see what their library composition was. And ultimately, I think I'd argue that the story is about complementarity. And the end of the article breaks out and looks at 10 different markets, because that's actually the only way any of this stuff matters. If you're in Brazil, you don't care what services are available other places or how many hundreds of countries things are in. What's available to you? And to look at the different kinds of markets and to see what the complementarity or lack of complementarity, as Canada's not unusual here. Australia, the UK, also very little domestic production in anybody's services, but everywhere, but in non-English dominant countries, that's not the case. I can talk more about these things later. So the work then, since I've been editing the work of fabulous experts in places that I don't know much about and learning a ton in both the streaming video anthology and the a special issue of IJCS, which it will publish next year. All the articles are now online first, to understand the story of the emergence of streaming in different countries, because that's really the only way to understand them. There is no global streaming industry, but at least at this point, to understand things, we need to start on the ground and then look for patterns. And so I've been very pleased to help support that work. I've been off writing by myself. I've been looking at the stories, and we're just going to have to leave it at that because we're running out of time. And basically trying to finally connect all of this industrial work with an argument about what has happened in terms of the range of commercially viable storytelling and stories told. I'm hoping next to ask what and how does this matter to viewers? How are people watching now? How do they understand what is a very different environment of programming? And because this talk is structured as a journey and we're still on it, there is no proper conclusion. And I will say thank you and ask for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Do we have questions? Yes, Mark?
Amanda, thanks so much for your talk, and thanks so much for your work. I teach it often and start with portals, and it's really helpful for both thinking about what's changed and what's stayed the same. And so it's a bit of also thank you for creating the categories of analysis that are really helpful, even if things transform over time. But the question's a bit about a historical one, because I've always been curious what you thought. As a television scholar, television has gone through multiple periods of change, and I'm just curious, we often think of this period as a period of especially fast change, and I was wondering, looking over the longer span of television, maybe in the US context, where, is it a particularly, are we just thinking that things are changing so quickly because we're in it right now, or is this particularly faster moment of change in, say, the 50s or 80s or 90s?
That's a great question. I think the tricky part of answering it is where we end up on what is television in this. Is I think part where I think you're right to sort of push back or at least question the thesis that so much has been changing so quickly. In the moment, I think there's a chance that a lot of what we've been talking about as television will be like, oh no, that was this entirely other thing. I could have, when it was 2023. So I can imagine 10 years from now, that someone looking historically at it will be able to see much clearer distinction, and that an awful lot of television, depending on where you draw the lines around television, actually not much has changed, or sort of the number of people watching it has changed. If we isolate television to, let's say, a linear experience, the broadcasters that we're familiar with, the last decade, I think so. Yes, they've moved to more reality programming for the most part until I think we're on the cusp of bigger change for them. But until sort of the last 12 to 18 months. Their economics have been pretty okay. So now I think there's probably a way in which, in the future, we'll be able to tell this history and sort of it won't seem nearly as disruptive, because we'll understand that internet distributed television was never actually television. It was really always this other thing, and we can talk about its history of it's following a very typical pattern of sort of chaotic experimentation in its initial years, and we're on the path still toward it too becoming less chaotic and varied. So that's I never thought about it that way, but that's really interesting to look at it at television as sort of separate from all this.
Well, I was even thinking about your way of describing like streaming as part of the television history. I guess I'm convinced in that sense. But yeah, thank you.
I didn't talk much about television will be revolutionized in this in this talk, but certainly in 2006, I thought the post-network era was going to happen faster, for sure. I really thought that within 20 years we'd have this thing worked out, but I shouldn't have thought that. So I haven't gone back to sort of reconceptualize those periodizations lately. Louisa?
I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about how changes in distribution practices impact form, which then impact changes in production and changes in distribution practices, and maybe like either within different national contexts. Like I'm thinking Sean Ryan just came and spoke at our college about like the writer's strike impact of the shifts to like shorter form television structures on writers' rooms, and how writers aren't getting the same types of contracts anymore, and then how that's changing what the potential future is as they're moved to these new, more expensive systems. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Oh, that's a giant question. I'll answer a bit of it, which is to say, and you're pointing at the U.S. versus everywhere else dynamics, I think, is important. Because what is happening to Hollywood what is happening to Hollywood, much more so than it's happened in a very different way than I think a lot of other national industries. Hollywood's hegemony is being challenged, and quite that's at its core. The sense of loss, the sense of disadvantage. Most of that is happening somewhat specifically to Hollywood because of the things that have allowed it to have its hegemonic status are being chipped away. It's been funny to funny, that's cruel. It's been interesting to watch it from the outside, where the things that U.S. talent are complaining about have been normal everywhere else for decades. So there's a little bit of hubris, I think, to what's happening. So I will say generally, most countries, limited series production is the norm. In the new work, I talk about that the U.S. had an industrial-grade mode of production throughout most of the 20th century that prioritized efficiency, and that's what allowed 22-episode seasons, 15, 20-year runs, that wasn't normal, but I think it was very easy within the U.S. to think of that as normal. Many other places have for a long time commissioned, let's get the money together and we'll make 10 episodes of this thing. And between some government funding maybe and some foreign financing, we'll pull it off. And then a year later, it turns out some people like that, maybe we can do it again. And so in the US, it's being regarded as this is the thing that Netflix is doing to us. This isn't how the industry is working. This is how the industry has worked for a long time. Most other countries' writers never had residuals. There was not a significant secondary market to create that kind of affluence that much of Hollywood regards as normal. So it's not to say that that's not really difficult for the U.S. industry to be experiencing, and it's going to probably continue to be difficult. But this ties back to that, sort of understanding. An economist would not like this classification, but it's how I think of this as kind of the macroeconomics of the structure. So much, why did we have peak TV, right? Where was all that money coming from? And so much of that was coming from US cable subscribers. So you begin to take that money away because they're not paying it anymore. You take away hours of production. The idea that over the last decade we both increased the amount of production and budgets doubled, if not tripled, and even more in yet other cases, right? This thing was unsustainable if we looked at it in terms of the numbers. My colleague Kevin Sanson has been looking at sort of the US, and he was talking to folks just before the strike, and an agent very honestly said, in truth, this is a corrective. Since the 1990s, which is when US series began to really rely on global revenue, he's like, we experienced this jump in the 90s in terms of our revenue and our earnings, and we were making far more money than we should have been. And this is now, the end of that. And so I think that's the broader context to appreciate what's happening. And I guess, as a critical scholar, forever we railed about, Hollywood domination. And I think we have to, on some level, be excited about the opportunities that exist in the circulation of content from many other places. But that the consequence of that is that there's less work available for Hollywood, because at the end of the day, there are two ways to get money, as far as I figured out. You either get the advertisers to pay, or you get consumers to pay. And consumers in many places are increasingly saying we're tapping out, and the advertisers are also now going up. They have many more places to buy our attention. And that, I think, is that we haven't quite had the reckoning there, but that's coming. And so that doesn't mean we're not going to have good stories. It just means that the balance has to get worked out. We need to get to sustainability instead of chasing endless growth, which is something that we can say about so many industries. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for the historical overview of the different approaches to streaming. It's really stimulating. The point I'd like to discuss with you is about Netflix and the question national and or global view experience about Netflix. But you have already partially answered that. I think it's both. The editorial interface is national or local, crisscross by cultural local imaginaries, as a classification des gens, je sais pas comment on dit en anglais. Voilà. Or the content can be national, but also international. And when productions are national, they are part of logics of content standardization and anthropological universalization of narratives. So there are different dimensions to this question, local or global. And you said that Netflix is obviously different from cable or satellite. Yes, but sometimes in terms of audience, du public, en termes d'usage, pardon, they can come close. I'm thinking about diaspora people, migrant people, diaspora people, who watch fiction from their countries of origin countries, just as they watch satellite TV. So what do you think about this? Sorry for my English.
No, it's way better than my French. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think I think there's a lot of questions that we need to be asking in this area. So, and I'm going to talk about Australia and the way it's been having this conversation, because it's a context that I know, but I think it is applicable in other places. For the 5 years that I have been in Australia, the government has been trying to figure out what to do about streamers. And most of that conversation has been about putting on a content quota, which the problem in the Australian context with what they're trying to do is that there is a distinction between economic policy and cultural policy. And cultural policy, the rules in Australia, are the rules that we have on broadcasters about how much needs to be produced domestically, that was cultural policy. And cultural policy could have criteria that I would, like the bar for what makes something Australian is kind of right here. I mean, right, the bar for what makes something Australian, for the most part, is it made in Australia, and does it have a fair number of Australians making it? And that worked in the olden days. That worked when what they were making was for 3 commercial broadcasters, 2 PSBs, whose goal was to attract the attention of Australians, right? So you could have kind of a pretty low bar, because these people were they were trying to make programming for Australians.
Yes.
But that's not the world anymore, right? And so the problem, Australia still hasn't decided. I haven't checked lately. Supposedly that was going to happen in June, and then it was going to happen in October. And so I'm waiting, bated breath, to see if they actually end up doing anything. But simply creating a quota with that bar will be meaningless. It will be it will be an economic policy, which frankly, in terms of who is advocating for it, that's all they want. They don't really care about making Australian stories, even though that is the rhetoric, because that is effective rhetoric. But if the bar continues to be only, is it shot in Australia with Australian talent, we will not get Australian stories. Because the motivation of the services that we are putting these on, Australia was hungry for a service. I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but by population, we've been the most penetrated Netflix country, and with very little complaint. Like Australians love it because we really didn't have a good cable or satellite. It was a monopoly. It was owned by Fox. Very poor value for cost, and so we have embraced as a country streaming, but clearly not because we are desperate for Australian content. And so when you look at a company like Netflix, Australians, although the country is highly subscribed, we only make up 3% of their subscriber base. So the idea that 20%, so we keep, the Australian production company keeps looking at France and saying, look what they're doing in France, without recognizing we're a much smaller country, A, and B, we speak English. But anyway, there are problems. So I'm all for quotas, but only if the definition changes so that we actually get the cultural policy intended. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to get things like, I don't know if you saw Clickbait, that wonderful series that was set in Oakland, California, but shot in Melbourne. That's what we get without sort of making sure that first answering the question, is this cultural policy or economic policy? And then making sure that the way the rule is constructed delivers on what the goal is. So I know I didn't get it directly, but the dynamics are so different place to place.
There was one last question.
Hi. So I'm I'm directing a project that is trying to have this impossible mission of gathering everything that you've talked about. Well, not everything, but the industry strategies with stories and with reception.
Oh, great.
Let's
talk more.
We are at the beginning of the project, and one of the accents of the project is actually looking at how commercial and national platforms, public versus commercial, national versus global platforms are having different strategies and how this influences stories and reception. And so my question to you is, so if we divide the two different economic strategies of either advertising or subscription models, how do public television fit in that model? Because they are kind of funded by subscribers in a way, by taxpayers.
Depending on the country, it gets regarded differently,
by taxpayers that also sometimes complain about, or at least in Norway,
they complain also about how high that tax is for television.
Mm.
So, and how does that influence because they have different stories
Mm.
than global platforms such as Netflix. So
Yeah.
how does that affect you?
Yeah. So I think everything that I said today was really imagining a world only in terms of commercial television. And I think like if we start the way that you organize species, kingdom, phylum, class, order. I still remember that bit of biology, right? So the first distinction I think we have to make is commercial, non-commercial. And then I think a lot of what I was doing today is like, okay, once we've got commercial, how do we divide it into different categories where we can say intelligible things? And I think, just as an aside, I think the thing that's coming that's not going to make anything easier is that we're moving into this world of SAVOD, or subscriber and advertiser video on demand. Like it's going to take at least 5 years for that to figure out. And I think the things that we already know based on linear aren't going to apply easily to that environment. So let's just let that aside. All right, but that leaves us still with this non-commercial space, which is super important. But I think at the streaming services were never in any way, the commercial streaming services were never a replacement for what publicly funded, non-commercial services could offer. I think it was confusing sometimes early on because the kinds of things services relying on subscriber funds were producing looked more like content that we associate with public service. And that has everything to do with, like, they have to get people to pay for it. So they have to provide something different than you can get for free. But even if the industry stopped changing and we just let it continue to play out as it had established itself, let's say a couple of years ago, commercial subscriber funding is still commercial. It would not have the same values as a public service charter. And so then you start getting into the nuances of different public service charters and what they're aiming to do, and that's tricky, so it makes it difficult to talk broadly. I think generally I continue to say public service is more important, or as important now as it's ever been. None of the things that are happening replace it. It gives it new tools, to the degree that some public service broadcasters or media have sort of seen it as their mission to fill the holes that commercial services weren't providing. Those may be changing, right? So it may now be that different things that the commercial system didn't provide, the commercial system does provide, but there's still holes in what the commercial system provides. And so I think it's a great time for public service media to reconsider what is its mission in the country, what is its priority, and to follow that. And I think to come back to your, everyone's always complaining about not paying so much for things. But I think the challenge across the board is value proposition. Do you have a clear value proposition, whether you are a government-funded service, a subscriber-funded service? You can kind of, if it's ad-funded, well, the advertiser's the client there. So you don't have to worry so much about the people. You just have to keep them watching. But as far as how many services can be sustainable, a lot of that comes back to, well, are you offering a distinctive value proposition? And that's where in some places we're seeing Netflix's value proposition is sort of a library of 5,000 titles from quite different places. That library's been pretty solid in terms of things aren't coming and going a lot. But it's also, it's diverse. In other words, you have Adam Sandler movies and you have, I'm sorry, I watch TV with my children a lot. They're teenagers. It's very good for my media scholarness, but I lose sight of what regular people watch. Anyway, there's still room for a lot of other things around that. And it's just, I think it's a matter of finding that new equilibrium. and making sure that public service is creating programming that is filling hole, to continue to say, to do something different, and that a population needs, albeit much trickier now, in that, I don't know, I think, do we have faith in humanity or not today? It's always that, in the past, the environment of scarcity allowed those services so much more power in terms of, there aren't very many things available and people are just going to choose what's there. Like, we are in a world in which there's a lot available. And so I think that does make it challenging in terms of delivering a thing that maybe people didn't realize they wanted or they didn't realize they need, and make sure that they find it in that environment. So I think that is a challenge.
Thank you very much. A great way to end this beautiful and amazing presentation. Thank you, Amanda.